So the title for today's talk is Diversity in the Biomedical Sciences, What, Why, Where, and How We Move Forward. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gibbs.
Thank you for the invitation. It's always fun to be here. Are the slides? Great. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right, there we go. Usually I give talks, so I say, which is true, I grew up in Black Baptist church tradition, so I'm used to call and response. I want to make sure we're awake. I know it's post-lunch. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here, and I'll share some thoughts from both my lived experience and work experience on this issue of diversity in the biomedical sciences. And again, you can see some of my contact there. Follow NIGMS training. That's one of the things I always plug. Okay, so this talk will contain content related to my official capacity as a federal employee, as well as my lived experience in science as a black man for the last 20 years. So I started actually in research when I was, well, actually more than 20 years, but when I was 15. I grew up in Durham, North Carolina, and so my high school summer jobs were working in labs at Duke and UNC. And so all that shapes, I've been funded by the government. I now work in the government. I've researched this stuff. So all that is in this talk. And so if it's an official view of the NIH, there'll be an NIH logo on the slide. And I'll use a more staid voice. Other than that, I will just kind of think out loud. And hopefully we can think together, because the goal isn't to this is the one proclamation, but just things that I've noticed about how we sometimes do things well, and sometimes how we don't do things well, even when we intend to do things well, and how that might impair our ability to move forward. So again, I was thinking, what are we talking about? Why does this matter? Where are we now? Where I'll share some data that papers I've published, and then thinking some thoughts about how we move forward. Okay, so what is diversity, right? People use it to mean lots of things. So a few years ago, I got asked to write a piece for Scientific American, and I wrote a title, Diversity in STEM, What It Is and Why It Matters. And what I did was I went to the dictionary, because you realize that oftentimes we use words in manners that aren't consistent with what they mean in the English language. And so diversity there, a range of different things, which is important. A state of being diverse is not a particularly helpful definition of diversity, but a range of different things is. And so I wrote there, diversity in science refers to cultivating talent and promoting the full inclusion of excellence across the social spectrum. And I think that's important because it includes people who are from historically underrepresented groups, or peers, as David Asai might say, as well as those from well-represented groups, right? And as I've thought about this in a few years, I realized some of the words that we use, like talent and excellence, can be used as cudgels to keep people out. And so now I'm thinking about, I didn't have time to think about a new word for talent, but I thought about rigor, right? Because what we're trying to have is people who are rigorous, who come from a lot of different backgrounds and can contribute to this enterprise that we're in, right? And I'll do my first mini rant, but diversity is not, my colleagues know this, so diversity is not a property of individuals, right? So I'm a black man, I'm not a diverse person. And we laugh, but sometimes we say, these are our diversity students. And it's like, well, what does that mean? If I was at Morehouse, for example, where most of the people are black men, would I be diverse? No, because nobody's ever diverse, right? And so, again, just think about that. And I think particularly it's not a property of certain groups. And so black or Latinx or indigenous scientists are not diverse by virtue of race or ethnicity, right? Because, again, sometimes you hear this and you read it in reports. It's like, well, we'll make sure we recruit our diversity students. And I know it's well-meaning. I just think people should use the words that they mean more precisely, as opposed to having this large category where some people are diverse and some people aren't. And so the way I've thought about that is, we have well-known power differentials, binaries, white, non-white, male, non-male, that kind of stuff. And so I sometimes call it the WHAM, because sometimes people say if you're not you have white, heterosexual, able-bodied, Anglo, middle-class men, and then everybody's diverse, who's not one of those categories. And so this is not what we mean when we talk about diversity. We're really talking about how do we include everybody in the scientific enterprise, right? You with me? Okay, and so in thinking about the terms, diversity really, we're talking about numbers, numerical representation. Can you count, right? And so we're saying, what percent of folks come from these historically underrepresented groups, which is an important thing to say, but it's not these percent of people are diverse. Inclusion and belonging then moves to felt experience within the biomedical enterprise. So you can have a person there, but if they don't feel and are not part of the everyday experience, then we're not necessarily accomplishing what we, I think, hope to accomplish by having a more diverse workforce. And then you get to things like equity and justice, which is really about treatment, and do people have fair access to opportunities and resources? And then we start to look at outcomes. And so many of the outcomes that we see where there are disparities, they may or may not be diversity issues, they may be issues of equity that then get mediated down and then we see the numbers at the bottom. All with me? Okay. So I was asked to talk a little bit about why this matters, and I'm going to do that in 2 slides. My assumption is that if you're at this talk, you think it matters. And so there are 2 different arguments that I've seen around this. One is the utilitarian argument that you get better science when you have a more diverse pool of people, which is true. So Scott Page wrote a book a few years ago. He wrote an article that was published in PNAS maybe 15 years ago on diversity. And the take is that, the more diverse group you have, particularly for solving hard and non-routine problems, the better outcomes you get, right? And so science is a collection of hard and non-routine problems, right? And importantly, they showed that if you have a group of the best performers that are more homogeneous versus a diverse group of competent performers, the diverse group will outperform the top flyers, right? And so that's the utilitarian argument. This has also been manifested from NIH in terms of policy. And so this was written a few years ago by Drs. Hannah Valentine, who's the Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity, and Francis Collins, the Director of NIH, who said that the lack of diversity is limiting the promise of our biomedical enterprise to build the knowledge and improve the nation's health. So they're saying, hey, the lack of diversity is not just a feel-good thing, it actually is a thing that's required to achieve our mission. And so you can see a notice of interest of diversity recently updated from NIH, but it talks about, again, these are positive things from a policy perspective: scientific innovation, public trust, global competitiveness, right? Like, the majority of children born in the U.S. are non-white. So if the U.S. wants to have a robust scientific enterprise, you have to include all people. Half of the white children are women or female, right? So you can't have the best of anything if you're systematically excluding 75% of the potential pool, right? It's just not possible, or it's improbable, right? And so you have to put the assumption should be that you're not getting the best if you're excluding lots of people, and you have to disprove that that's the case. So that's the utilitarian argument. I think there's also the moral argument that everybody deserves opportunity. And so last month, Harvard Business Review put out a 5-part series on advancing black leaders. And I think it's a really interesting thing. I would commend it to you to read because the first piece was toward a racially just workplace. And they said, in business, which also in science, we make these utilitarian arguments, which are good, but there's also a moral argument, right? We can't simply ask what's the most lucrative thing to do. We must also ask, what's the right thing to do, right? The imperative should be on creating a context where people of all colors, but especially those who have historically been oppressed, or the peers, as David Asai would say, can fully realize their potential, right? And I think that's just a really important piece there, because sometimes when we talk about diversity, and again, it's well-meaning, the utilitarian arguments make sense, you do get better outcomes, but sometimes it can sound like as a person who's not from the dominant group, is there to make the lived experience of my white brothers and sisters better in science. And that's not why I'm there. I'm there to contribute, just like my white brothers and sisters are there to contribute. So we all deserve opportunity, right? And so I just want to make sure that as we think about it from a utilitarian perspective, which is a real thing, that we don't lose sight of the fact that people deserve opportunity because they're people, and we want people to be able to contribute. So where are we now? This was published a few years ago in the journal Life Sciences Education, which is published by ASCB by Drs. Hannah Valentine, Kay Lund, and Dr. Allison Gamby from NIGMS. And so what you see here are groups that are mathematically well represented. That's white, Asian, non-resident. And then you have groups that are from historically underrepresented minority backgrounds or peers, so Black, Latinx, American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, right? And again, it's just mathematics because we're talking about diversity here. But as you can see, in yellow, you have men that are from well-represented backgrounds. In gray, you have men that are from historically underrepresented racial ethnic backgrounds. Orange, you have women from well-represented racial and ethnic backgrounds. And blue, you have underrepresented minority women. And basically what you see is that as you go through time, the yellow bar gets bigger, all the other bars get smaller. And so whereas at the associates or even at the doctoral level, the vast majority of people who get PhDs in the biomedical sciences are women, underrepresented men or women. We don't see that as we go on. And even at the assistant professor level, we start to see gaps. And so this was the Scholarship of Diversity, so I'm going to do about 10 or 15 minutes on some data that I've published. I was talking earlier, some of them are like greatest hits. So, Beyonce can still go out and sing songs from the early 2000s, so I'm going to bring up some hits as well as some new things I've been thinking about that I've collected prior to my time at NIH. So we think about the career pathway for scientists and underrepresented groups, and a lot of this was thinking about myself and then my other colleagues, many of us who had gone through really all these training programs to enhance diversity, have PhDs from elite institutions. I have a PhD from Stanford I published in one-word journals. But then we're finding that the path wasn't one that we were interested in pursuing. And so I am very happy that we much less frequently talk about the pipeline where you decide to pursue a PhD and then sometime later out pops a faculty member. But, there are a number of different decision points, intervening training pathways. So you decide to pursue a PhD, and then you have grad training, which is 5, 6, 7 years, often in early adulthood. Lots of things are changing in life. People get married, have babies, have different kind of life values coming into play. And you decide what to do about a postdoc. And if you decide not to do a postdoc, traditionally you're moved to a career outside of research, which is a great career. I have one of those careers right now. But then if you do a postdoc or a couple postdocs, you still have to decide what you want to do after that. And then faculty can become, a faculty career at a research university, a faculty career you primarily are teaching, and then research careers outside of academia. And so I asked just some basic questions like, what's the process of career interest formation for recent biomedical PhD graduates? And then to what extent does this process differ based on social identities or social categories, specifically race, ethnicity, gender, and where possible, the intersections of those two? Not always possible to get the numbers broken down that way, but we try to look. And so this has been a series of collaborations with colleagues. Again, most of this was when I was, before I was at NIGMS. One's Kimberly Griffin, who's an associate professor of education, and then David Bronatielski, who's a systems engineering professor, associate professor at GW. And so I published these papers. If you put me into PubMed, you can find all these things. What we did was a series of mixed methods. So with Kim, we did a mixed methods approach to understanding individual career decisions. And so we focused specifically on U.S. citizens and permanent residents, mainly because there are different calculi if you're not a citizen. And we did focus groups, in-depth interviews, and then a national survey, which included a couple hundred scientists from historically underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. And then with David, we looked at survey data from the National Science Foundation around who gets a PhD, as well as from the AAMC faculty roster. So the AAMC is the Association for American Medical Colleges. Their building's actually right across the street from the convention center. And this group of schools gets the vast majority of NIH extramural research funding. And so if we want to enhance the diversity of the extramural workforce, that goes hand in hand with diversifying the faculty at AAMC schools. Okay, so the first question we looked at is, what's your interest in a faculty career, particularly these various career pathways when you finish your PhD? And so I'm going to walk you through, this is a logistic regression. So in blue, we have white or Asian men. In red, we have underrepresented minority men. In green, we have white or Asian women. And in purple, we have underrepresented minority women. And what this says is, what are the relative odds that on a survey where we say 1 to 5, how interested are you in a faculty career at a research-intensive university when you finish your PhD, that you would answer 4 or 5. So I am interested or very, very strongly interested. And then what we did is that we controlled for a whole bunch of factors that we know are important. So were you interested when you started? Did you have good relationship with your advisor? How much did you publish? Because sometimes we hear that the best rise to the top and everybody else takes an alternative career, which is not true, but this is some of the discourse that you hear if you're in this space. Maybe where did you get your PhD? Do you have efficacy? Are you confident in your ability as a researcher? And other measures. So when you control for all these factors, you see that white or Asian women and underrepresented minority men and women are 36 to 54% less likely than a similarly situated white or Asian man to say they're interested in the career when they finish their Ph.D. So just take a second to think about that. Even if you control for how much you've published or how good your mentoring relationship was, you're still significantly less likely if at the end of your PhD to have an interest in a faculty career at a research-intensive institution. And so for me as a biologist, I think, well, if you've controlled for basically everything within the system is probably exerting a differential selective pressure on people based on identity. And that's not really what we want, right? And again, you don't see that for all faculty positions because you don't see differences for faculty at teaching intensive institutions. People have the same level of opinions, interests, and then research careers outside of academia, again, you don't see anything statistically significant different. But then you see for careers outside of research, underrepresented minority women are nearly twice as likely as everybody at the end of their PhD to say they want a career outside of research, even when they publish the same amount, even when they have the same advisor relationships. And so for me, this allowed me to see that what I was seeing with my peer group was happening at a more national level, and just the tragedy of that for these sisters and for science. I've said before, one of the things that got me into this was a couple of my friends, 3 black women, at elite East Coast institutions, and they all published first author papers in one-word journals. And which again are good journals. I publish in them, right? There are lots of different kinds of good journals. And 2 of them had such terrible experiences, they said, I'll never do science again. And one said, I'll do science, I'll never do academia. And I thought, well, this is a shame for them because you should not be brutalized by doing good science, and for all of us because we're missing out on their contributions to our enterprise. So this is a thing that we look at the level of individual interests. And so then what does that look like at a system level? So this is the paper that I worked on a few years ago with David Bronatiowski when I was a policy analyst. And so what this is in gray are the PhD graduates in basic biomedical disciplines as categorized by FASEB from 1980 to 2013 versus the number of assistant professors in basic science departments in AAMC institutions. And so what you see is essentially a 9-fold increase through time for underrepresented PhDs and a much less significant increase at the faculty level. But if you look at groups from well-represented backgrounds, again, you see increases from about 4,000 to 8,000, and then at the faculty level from about 3,200 to 5,500. Now, this thing that went up right here is the NIH budget doubling, essentially, in the early 2000s. So as the budget grew, a lot more grad students came into the system. But when you normalize it based on where you started in 1980, you see there's a 9-fold increase for underrepresented minority PhD attainment and less than 3-fold for faculty. And then for well-represented groups, you see a better alignment between the increase in the PhD pool and the faculty pool. So while the job market is difficult, you only see this uncoupling for scientists from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. We see basically an exponential increase in PhD attainment, but not the same at the faculty level. And if you dive down even deeper for the last decade or so from when this was published, there were over 6,600 Black, Latinx, Indigenous PhDs granted between 2005 and 2014. But there were 6 fewer assistant professors in basic science departments in that time. So I'll just let that sit for a second. Now, if you look at well-represented groups, there were 81,000. So there is a difference in magnitude, but we did see the overall pool grew. And so the argument, the point of this is sometimes you'll hear, well, they don't exist. And I'm like, nah. Every year there's about 800 to 1,000 of us that graduate each year in the biomedical sciences. So we exist. I was like, there's a lot in my Facebook, which is what I say a lot, I was like, and on my Twitter. But I do recognize that we might not be showing up in application pools because of the previous slide around interest and the environments that people are choosing to enter or not to enter. So then we said, okay, what can you do about it? So I worked with David to create this system dynamics model. So system dynamics is a tool that policy folks use to model different outcomes at a system level. There are other tools like network analysis or agent-based modeling, but system dynamics is the one that we thought was best for this. And what we did, and that model went from 1980, and we fit it from 1980 to 2015 based on existing data, and then we extrapolated out to 2080 to see where things might change. And then we modeled the impact of a couple different things. One, let's increase the talent pool. Because maybe 6,000 just isn't enough. Maybe you got to get to 10,000 or 20,000. And then you start to see a tipping point. Or maybe it is, the job market, because concurrent with this dialogue, there are dialogues about fixing bigger issues in biomedicine. So Bruce Alberts very famously came out, and Shirley Tillman, Kirshner, and Harold Varmus also came out with rescue biomedicine from its systemic flaws. So maybe it is a labor market issue, or maybe it's a focus on transitions from these talented contributors onto the job market and then being hired. And because of the model, I assume we continue to have exponential growth of the URM population, and we assume no bias in hiring. So there's no racism, no sexism in this model. That's good, right? It's a good world. So I've been talking to you all for 20 minutes, and pedagogy tells me I should give you a break. So you're going to talk to your neighbor and tell me. So here we go. We got a 2x2 chart, and you're going to do a 1-minute active learning exercise. So what we have here is an intervention, so we can increase the number of assistant professor positions, either no change or 100 per year, or we can increase the rate of transition of the URM PhDs onto the faculty market up to just to 10%, right? Because right now it's basically completely decoupled. So if we did this, by the year 2080, 73% of PhDs would be from historically underrepresented groups. We would be overrepresented minorities, ORMs. And so, again, in the model, we say we're going to keep having exponential growth. We're going to have no bias in hiring. And based on our current levels of transition, how many folks, what would be the representation at the faculty level, at the assistant professor level? Here are your options. A, less than 25%, B, 25 to 50%, C, 50 to 75%, or D, greater than 75%. So take 1 minute, talk to a neighbor, and then I'll ask for hands in a moment. So, okay, active learning. Twenty seconds. Okay, class, we're ready to resume. So, show of hands, who thinks the answer is, so the question is, if in the year 2080 we had 73% of PhDs were Black, Latinx, Indigenous, given our current dynamics of transitions from postdoc to faculty jobs, what percentage would be assistant professors? So who thinks A? Raise your hands. Oh, man, pessimistic crowd. B? There we go. I like the optimism. C? There. Be brave. B, yeah, I should have everybody close their eyes. D? There we go. Okay, so A was correct, right? If, given where we are now, even if basically everybody was an underrepresented minority and there was no bias, because of the complete decoupling of what I call PhD and JOB, so like the PhD pool in the job market, you would have fewer than 10% of faculty would be from underrepresented minority backgrounds. And even if you increase the number of jobs by 100 or even 1,000 per year, you would still see no difference. But importantly, there is hope, because if you transition the people who are on the market and then you hire them and then you keep them, we actually have good representation in the job market. And again, once we start seeing there's a really marginal impact of the overall job market, it's really the idea is on the transitions of people from the pool onto the job market and then them getting higher. And so the takeaway there is that increasing the number of PhDs from historically underrepresented groups will only affect faculty diversity to the extent these scientists enter the job market as candidates and are hired and then retained. So I'm going to spend 5 minutes on a new thing that is some data that I collected before I got to NIGMS and that I'm slowly thinking about. And so we asked folks, we did in-depth interviews. So we did that big survey of about 1,900 STEM PhDs, and then we culled it down to the people who went to the top 50 schools, which is top 50 in terms of science and engineering dollars. and they had at least one first author research paper in PubMed. So people who minimally meet a qualification to move forward. And they had gotten their PhDs in the last few years, and half of them were postdocs, half were doing other things, including a quarter were faculty. Because the first paper that I published with Kim Griffin in this area showed that values matter a lot. And so we asked people toward the end of the interview, it was a 60 to 90 minute or 120 minute interview, depending on how loquacious one of the participant was. And we said, what's important to you in your career? What's important to you to have accomplished by the end of your career? So you might want to think about that for yourself, right? Like, values matter, and people are moving in spaces and hoping to accomplish various things. So we asked people, what do you hope to accomplish by the end of your career? And we let them talk, and we wrote down what they said, and then we categorized it. And so the big six that we saw, there's a lot of data here, or a lot of words here, but the big six were impact, intellectual engagement, life balance, science, STEM diversity, and students. And so a person who said science, their idea was they wanted to advance basic scientific society. And so a person would say something like, I just want to be able to contribute to the knowledge base in my field. That's what they hope to accomplish. A person with STEM diversity would say that we categorize as STEM diversity, they wanted to positively influence access and success in STEM for people from historically underrepresented and marginalized groups. And so one person said, if I'm reading my scientific eulogy, the first two things I want out their mouth, I hope would say that he was a great mentor and he helped diversify science for the betterment of science as a whole. So again, lots of people say the same things using different words. And so what you can see is that in this sample of around 70 scientists who recently got their PhDs, students in science were the first two, right? And so this is the pie chart. Black means yes, white means not. So ultimately, you see, there's not one set of values. Lots of people have different types of values, and you could have multiple ones listed here. So we didn't just pick one. We said whatever you said that fell into this category. There were a couple others, but for time, I didn't put them up here. And so students from 45%, and then intellectual engagement about 28%. So the next slide I'm going to show you is breaking this down by underrepresented status of the people in the sample. And so what you see here, I'll walk through. Red are underrepresented, are the peers, and then white or Asian are in the blue bubble. And so what you see is that as it relates to students, 49% of historically underrepresented folks said they wanted to do something with students. 36% of white or Asians said they didn't want to do, they wanted to do something with students. So that wasn't a lot of difference. For science, we see pretty good equality. For life balance, about half of the white or Asian folks said they wanted to do something, life balance was a priority, and about a third of underrepresented folks said that. And so again, we just said if they actually said it. The absence of saying it doesn't mean they don't care, but we said what came out of your mouth. Because I'm going to go down in one moment. And one time I got some pushback when I presented at Gordon a few years ago. Impact. Because often you hear, oh, well, the minorities want to do stuff to impact the community. But we didn't see a difference there. But for when we got to STEM diversity, interestingly, 42% of the underrepresented minorities said, I want to diversify science as part of my professional life. And none of the white or Asian folks said that. Now, I do not think white or Asian people are racist and don't care. Because sometimes just the pushback you get is just say what comes out of your mouth, right? And ultimately, the majority of underrepresented folks didn't even say it. But you do see some population level differences on what's on people's minds as they move forward. And again, similarly with intellectual engagement, 55% of the white or Asian folks said that, whereas only 16% of the underrepresented folks said that, which doesn't mean we don't want to be intellectually engaged. It's just to say that people might have different values for why they're operating in this space. You need to be cognizant of that, because what happens, I'll say what happened to me, but I know from research happens to others, is you might hear, well, just wait till you get tenure and then worry about that. But you actually might be undermining people's value for staying in science, because you would never tell somebody who's really passionate about cancer biology, well, just study cardiac biology for 15 years so you get tenure and then do cancer. But you do tell people who have a value around equity issues to not do that, and that actually impairs their ability to stay in. So you need to, as a mentor, think about how can you find ways to integrate people's values, help them see how their values are integrated into the work they're already doing. Okay, final few slides. How do we move forward? And so this goes to the Black Baptist tradition that I mentioned earlier. We're going to do call and response, 3 parts. 3-part sermon, right? No, acknowledge. You say acknowledge, listen, and act. Acknowledge, listen, and act. Okay, So by acknowledge, I mean, let's acknowledge what's actually happening, including the unpleasant truths, right? We talk a lot about implicit bias, which is a real thing, right? Neuroscience tells us is to be human is to have biased cognition, including the human who's up here talking about diversity, right? There's also a whole lot of explicit stuff that's happening that we don't pay as much attention to. So I've been heartened to see in the last few years, we've talked about sexual harassment and the really, unacceptable barriers that women in science experience. I've seen a lot less conversation around issues of race, so I'll bring it up. Racism in the research lab. So Daniel Colon Ramos and Dr. Quinones, Hossa wrote this a few years ago in the New York Times, but just making the point of acknowledging racism and its heavy-handed presence in our communities. And those conversations don't just belong to those who are from minoritized backgrounds or peers. We've got to understand that our biomedical workforce and our society suffers if we don't engage these conversations, and that our silence is often being complicit in the problem, right? So there's just lots of different things happening. And I think, so I've been thinking a lot about this, kind of just using my scientific brain. So as experimental scientists, we have a null hypothesis, which is equality, right? So the public health degree really helped clarify that for me in the statistics. We're never proving difference, we're disproving equality, right? So our base is that A and B are equal, and then we say, how likely are you to see that difference given equality? And if the chance is 1 in 20, we have P is 0.05. If it's 1 in 1,000, you get the appropriate P. And so I think that this is really good in experimental context to assume equality and then work to disprove that, because you don't want to be biasing toward whatever your favorite hypothesis is. I think in the context of America and the institutions of America, it's probably more realistic to assume structural inequity and then bias, right? Which, again, when you open yourself up, then you say, oh, well, of course we're saying the disparate outcome. What systemic thing might be leading to that? And then work to, disprove that. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's looking out to get you. It's just the case that our systems were designed by a certain group of people, and every system designed by a group of people meets those group of people's needs and may or may not meet the other needs of other people. Even if they like the other people, it's just sort of like how humans work, right? And so I think opening ourselves up a little bit more is going to be helpful in not being shocked or surprised when these things happen, because it's America and we're humans, and these things happen. Part 2 is listen. And I think it's really important to listen to the students, postdocs, and faculty on your campuses. Sometimes when I give talks like this, then people come up afterwards and say, can you come to my university and give that talk? And sometimes, usually it's better in conferences like this, but they're like, okay, Kenny, tell us how to fix it. And I say, listen to the people who are here. Because I can talk about generalizable principles, but these things operationalize differently depending on your context, right? And so if you're not listening to the people who are there, then you're not really going to fix what's happening there where you are. And I think it's important to listen to learn, not to defend yourself or the perceived meritocracy of the institution, right? Because again, we all have good ideals. Many of us have good ideas and good intentions. I'll share 2 examples from my own life just to open it up, right? Because I'm not preaching as somebody who's got it all right. I have learned, you may have noticed from this talk if you don't know me, I process externally, and I get very enthusiastic about a lot of things. And so often when my colleagues are talking, if they say something that I'm interested in, I'll just like hop in with my thought. Now I have learned over the last few years that what I think of as enthusiasm, my colleagues, particularly my female colleagues, think of as another man talking over them, right? And so it doesn't matter what my heart is. My heart is to say, hey, I think this is important. That's why I'm engaging. I need to quiet my mouth, wait for them to finish, write down my thought to process it, and then if it needs to be shared, then I share it, right? But again, I think that's part of just saying, hey, even though this is where my heart is, how are other people experiencing this is the thing that matters more than where my own disposition is. And then the other example I share somewhat frequently is I manage a postdoc program, and we're really excited to have Jessica Polka come talk about preprints. I scheduled that on September 19th, 2018, which might seem like a random day. It's actually Yom Kippur. And I did not realize that, right? I'm, a religious guy. It just wasn't in my worldview. And so a couple of my colleagues pointed this out to me, and I was like, oh, I should change that, which I did, and it was fine because that could communicate to the Jewish brothers and sisters in the program that a day that might be of import to them is not of import to me. Now, I could have said, well, no, I'm not biased, or I could just change it and then make sure we put on the calendar every year to know when Yom Kippur is, because it changes, and then make sure we don't schedule things that day, right? So this is just real life examples of it doesn't really matter as much. It's good to have a good internal posture. What matters more is changing things so that people experience the environment as positive, right? And so I share so that other people can share their own. Now share with your neighbor your own, no, I'm just kidding. Your own blind spots. And then David Asai and Cliff Pujri wrote this in Life Science Education, which I commend to you, just about questioning assumptions as we're thinking through this work. And again, when we listen, again, it can be hard. This is from the HBR piece, but I thought it was great. Research shows that people are happy to talk about diversity and inclusion, but enthusiasm drops when you start talking about race. So most of us don't like to think very hard about minoritized people, where they sit in our organizations, what power they wield or don't, and much less discuss it. So again, it's hard, it's gonna be uncomfortable, but we are scientists. We solve hard problems. We put people on the moon. We do CRISPR, right? I'm a stem cell biologist. The craziest thing in the world to me, induced pluripotent stem cells, right? You can take a fibroblast, put the 4 Yamanaka factors in there, and get a whole mouse that can then procreate. Now that is wild. We can do this. We can have hard conversations if we do it with grace and we're open with each other, not from a position of I'm a good person. So finally, let's think about action. And I know that in a diversity talk, you're thinking about Isaac Newton, right? But I think Newton's first law is really helpful. Every object persists in a state of rest or uniform motion unless it is compelled to change by forces impressed on it. An object in motion stays in motion. So that can be a particle in a box during physical chemistry, or it can be the biomedical research workforce, which will recreate itself unless we have some external motion. Put another way, you have to change things for things to change, right? Which is, again, I'm just making the point that sometimes we think that talking or having the right internal posture is enough, but those things aren't enough. They're good, they're necessary, but not sufficient. Resource allocation and policy changes things more so than having the right internal posture. So I'll be Kenny federal employee for about 3 slides. Some of what we've done at NIGMS in this regard is some of our reform for graduate education. And so this is the T32 program, which funds about 3,000 students at over 100 institutions across the country. And what you see is that we wrote in the funding announcements that diversity at all levels is integral to research and training excellence, right? Which is important because this is the first time I believe this was done in a general training program. So we have certain programs that have the goal of enhancing diversity with particular attention to groups that are underrepresented, but this is a general program. So we say, hey, it's important in cell biology. It's important in computational biosciences. It's important in medical science training to have this stuff right and to be able to work well with people from lots of different backgrounds. And we put it in the scored review criteria, which is how NIH says something is important. You review it and you score it, right? And so you can read more about that on the NIGMS Feedback Loop blog or on the funding announcement. We also have a new program called Mosaic, which is maximizing opportunities for scientific and academic independent careers, which is really focused on that transition point that we talked about earlier into faculty, from the postdoc into faculty positions, particularly in research-intensive institutions, right? So it's a 2-part program, where it's a K-99 program to enhance diversity, and then an institutionally focused research education award to promote diversity. And so I will talk about that very briefly, which is to say, be aware of this, and particularly if you know postdoctoral scientists, especially from groups that are historically underrepresented, who are wanting to do the faculty career, please point them toward this announcement. I'm the program contact for it, and I'm happy to have conversations about it. And so what we're doing is that we're going to award these UE5s, which is just a cooperative agreement, to neutral organizations such as scientific societies. And then we're going to concurrently run a NIH K-99 competition to promote diversity. And so that's going to be 3 receipt dates a year. And then we're going to assemble cohorts of these Mosaic scholars organized by scientific areas within the missions of participating institutes and centers. And so that'll look like this through time. Each UE5 will have 5 cohorts of about 5 people, and then we have 3 of these UE5s. And so NIGMS expects us to grow to about 75 scholars by year 5, which is going to be the steady state, and then we'll continue the program. And there are other participating institutes and centers: Human Genome Research, NIBIB, Nursing, and Minority Health and Health Disparities, with at least 3 more have indicated their intentions to sign on, and some more are in discussions about it. And so keep an eye out on the funding announcement, because we will tweet about it at NIGMS training. It'll also be in the NIH guide as other ICs sign on. And these UE5s, we're hoping to provide scholars with additional mentorship, networking, career development, institutional responsibility. And we're encouraging applications by the 3rd year of postdoc training, really to facilitate people's moves onto independence. It wasn't always the case that people did 6- and 8-year postdocs. And so what we're trying to do with this is to get people to transition as expeditiously and appropriately as possible, with consideration for life events such as childbirth, which is common in the postdoc period. And we, like all of NIH, are very sensitive to that and give appropriate extensions for that. And I think importantly, this is, when we talk about resource allocation, this program at steady state is going to be $16 million, which is a real resource allocation. And we're not rating from the undergrad programs to fund this. It's additional resources that are being made available for this. And so this is a way that you can demonstrate that you're actually trying to do something to move a goal forward. And so as we act, I just say be thoughtful. What specific issues are you trying to approach? And don't take the anti-wham approach, right? And by that, I mean there are different kinds of issues, and some of them are overlapping, but some are distinct, right? And so think about mothers and young mothers, particularly in the postdoc phase, or black faculty, or maybe all your faculty from certain minority backgrounds, or even things like Asians in leadership, because folks from Asian backgrounds are 20% of the workforce and very underrepresented in leadership. And so there are lots of different issues. It won't be one size fits all. And just like if you're trying to change the genome of an organism or a cell, you wouldn't say, I'm just going to make it up. You use CRISPR. You use what's out there. So use the literature. Use what's out there. Use data. Think about, really, how will you know if you're making progress? Which is not a quota. It's just saying if you have a numerical goal, think about how you can measure that. And then start somewhere and iterate. So these are the last 2 slides. These are some of the things that I've seen recently that I thought have been helpful. So Nidhi Bala wrote a piece in MBOC this year on strategies to improve equity in faculty hiring. She's here, so you can ask her about that. Wave your hand. I think Freeman Rabowski and Peter Henderson from UMBC talked about the Meyerhoff program and their example as an undergraduate institution. I'm an alum of the Meyerhoff program, so I'm not shilling for it. I'm just saying they've done some work. Look at it. It might be helpful starting point for you. NIGMS actually funds a number of researchers in this area. And so we have a program called Research on Interventions. And so if you Google that, you can see the people that we funded, and many of the grantees there are doing really good and thoughtful work in this area around how do we improve opportunities for everybody. Kata Lorenzen wrote a piece about the context of diversity, and again, really important to think about different groups and the different experiences, and particularly the challenges that scientists who identify as black have. And then we're at ASCB, so there's a journal, Life Sciences Education, edited by Aaron Dolan in the corner over there. There was a special issue on broadening participation 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, but they regularly publish issues or publications in general science education, as well as issues around diversity and equity within the enterprise. So these are some places you can start. And I'll finish. Yeah, I do. It's really 2 more slides. So change is actually possible. And so as it relates to the faculty piece, in the paper we put out a thought experiment, not a quota, just a mathematical reality. So AAMC institutions hire around 1,000 assistant professors per year. So if you said we wanted the faculty pool to reflect the Ph.D. pool, that means that'd be about 10%, which means about 100 underrepresented minority faculty per year. There are about 150 AAMC institutions, which means that if 2/3 of institutions hired and retained 1 faculty member from any historically underrepresented group per year, for 6 years, we'd have parity in 1 tenure cycle, which is to say that the change is actually possible. Sometimes we talk about this like it's so hard, and I know it's America. We have large, seemingly intractable problems. But we can actually make change here as a community. So that's the charge, is think about the changes that you can make right now. and this is really it. I'm a signaling biologist. So in biology, we think a lot about the response in a complex system results from the upstream signals and the pathways. And so you don't change downstream unless you change what's upstream. So signaling biology, right? Like many people have probably seen these diagrams. You get a stimulus, you get upstream, downstream, and then you have the biological response, right? And so I think about the same thing in this world where if you have an equitable and just and inclusive environment as an upstream thing, which takes work, you will then have diversity as a byproduct. And then we'll have better science and a better society. And I would like us to lead on this instead of saying, well, this is hard and it's hard for everybody. I think science, we have the capability, we have the opportunity to lead. And I encourage us all to do that. So I really am done. Thank you. You can email me, follow NIGMS training, and I'm happy to take questions. If there are any. Is there questions? Jim, are there questions or should I? Okay, if there are any questions. Okay. Yeah, one question, and then I'm happy to talk afterwards.
Hi, Dr. Gibbs. Thank you very much for your talk. I think I have a combination of a comment and a question, so I'll try to combine the two. Mm-hmm. So I was hoping you could expound on what you were referencing before as far as doing what matters within a faculty pool. So I'm a fourth-year Ph.D. student in Columbia. I'm studying biomedical engineering. I went to Duke for undergrad, and I can count on one hand how many faculty were underrepresented minorities, at least at the time I was studying there. Mm-hmm. And as I understand faculty recruitment now, it seems as though there's more of an emphasis in a lot of departments as far as filling specific specialties and niches rather than considering race within faculty hiring. Mm-hmm. And as someone who is looking towards what I'm going to do after my PhD, I feel unfortunately led towards leaving academia, if not research altogether, because I've talked to the office of my dean and given suggestions on how to increase diversity, whether it's recruiting at HBCUs or Hispanic serving institutions, talking to NSBE and local SHIP chapters on campuses. And it doesn't seem like they are invested in making those efforts, and I don't want to end up in a career path where I feel like I'm not wanted or valued. And so, first question, do you feel like the average faculty or dean's office at these STEM schools or within STEM fields actually value diversity in their faculty? And if not, how do you instill that value in them?
Yes. This is being recorded. So do I feel so I can't speak for institutions other than NIH. What I have noticed in my lived experience is that so what I've said a lot is that people appreciate and don't value. So when you value things, you reorient resources to make it happen. I have found that people appreciate diversity. So I, black man, show up being diverse. Just kidding. But if I'm there, institutions are very happy to have me on the website and highlight my presence. And then there may or may not be the same level of responsiveness when I say, well, these are some challenges I'm having in this environment. And again, you're not alone. I've said before when I was at Stanford, and it's not just a Stanford problem, but there were more black presidents of the United States than there were black tenured faculty members in the basic sciences. So just think on that, 1 versus 0. So yeah, you're not alone. I would just encourage you to really think about, there are other models, right? And so we fund a program called IRACDA, IRACDA. If you're not familiar with it, look it up. It's a great program. Desiree Salazar is a program contact, and she's here in the audience as well, a program contact. But we fund postdocs to spend 75% of their time doing research, 25% of the time usually teaching at a minority serving institution. And these postdocs go on, 70% of them have careers, faculty careers in a wide range of institutions. And so I'm not going to tell you you're not seeing what you're seeing. I'm just telling you if you want to do it, there are opportunities for you. And so we can connect offline. Don't let the lack of appreciation, the real things you're seeing, make you stop. And then we can think with other people about where you can find a space that's going to be good for you, right? So the absence of seeing it in front of you doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Absence of seeing it in a lot of places doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? But there are places. It's an N of 1, really. Can you find the N of 1 that works for you? And so that's my encouragement. So we can talk offline. You said one question. Okay, one more if there's one. Okay. And was it okay? She has a question. She comes to the mic.
So sorry. I work at a majority white institution.
Yeah.
And
Me too.
I love your idea.
Yeah.
Thank you. You saying listen really impacted me.
Okay.
However, I'm hesitant to like call out people because
Yeah.
I don't want to make anybody feel isolated as a group because
Yeah.
they're a minority. How can I sensitively
Yeah.
have an event to listen to my students and see what resources they need?
Yeah, that's a great question. I encourage people to do a lot of reading, right? Because we live in the age of Google, right? There's a lot of stuff that you can read out there where people can share experiences. And I think having a broader repertoire and working with partners, right? And so sometimes if you like, everybody needs to feel valued and trusted, right? And so people can tell if you care, and I feel like if you're in a relationship where you care, because I'm in relationships where I care, and then I mess up, I think about my marriage as one, but other relationships where you're like, oh, when you can tell if people care and they're trying to do right, and that's different than like, I'm a good person, right? Like there's a difference there. So I think just being humble and open and saying, I'll probably mess up, but don't say, hey, you black students, come tell me about being black. But how is your experience here? Are there any barriers that you're experiencing? Are there any resources I can help you with? Because the pie charts show that there's not one uniform experience, right? So everybody has a range of experiences. And sometimes white guys feel alienated because they're away from their family. It's the first time that's happened. So I don't want to assume a certain thing, but just be open. And just if you have a broader repertoire available to you, then you can listen better. And then as a person with some institutional power, you can connect them with the resources that help them to navigate their system. Or you can be an advocate on their behalf and say, no, we actually need to stop this because we're hurting our students' ability to be successful here. Thank you all so much.